Before we begin, I want to say something important. If you're someone who believes that the most powerful stories are the quiet ones, the ones about family, love, mistakes, and the moments that change people forever, then take a second and subscribe to this channel. Because some stories aren't loud. They don't explode into chaos. They unfold slowly, piece by piece, until one day you realize something inside you has changed. And the story I'm about to tell you today is one of those. It's not a story about betrayal. It's not even a story about conflict. It's a story about a mother, a son, and the moment a parent realizes their child is no longer a child. And trust me, by the time the story reaches the end, you may see family, trust, and growing up in a completely different way. My name is Malene. I'm 39 years old. And for most of my life, I've been a single mother. My son's name is Zion. He's 19 now. But when I think about him, the first image that always comes to my mind isn't the tall young man he has become. It's a tiny baby, wrapped in a hospital blanket, holding my finger with his entire hand. I still remember the moment he was born. The room smelled like antiseptic and warm blankets. Nurses were moving around quietly. Someone handed him to me. And for the first time in my life, everything else disappeared. The world became silent. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. A promise I never said out loud. No matter what happens in this life, I will protect this child. And for 19 years, I tried to keep that promise. Being a single mother wasn't easy. There were nights I came home exhausted from late shifts, days when bills piled up on the kitchen table, moments when I wished there was someone else to help fix things around the house. But life didn't give me that option. So I learned. I learned how to fix a leaking sink with a YouTube tutorial. I learned how to assemble furniture with missing screws. I even learned how to patch drywall after Zion accidentally threw a baseball through the wall when he was 9. But I never complained. Because every sacrifice felt worth it. Every long night, every extra shift, every missed vacation. Because Zion wasn't just my son. He was my purpose. When he was little, he followed me everywhere. If I went into the kitchen, he came with me. If I sat on the couch, he climbed right next to me. Sometimes he would sit on the kitchen counter while I cooked dinner, swinging his legs and asking endless questions. Mom, why is the sky blue? Mom, why do dogs bark? Mom, do astronauts get lonely in space? I didn't always know the answers, but I tried. And on movie nights, he would fall asleep halfway through the film, curled up beside me with popcorn still in his hand. Those were the years when I knew everything about him. Every fear, every dream, every tiny secret. I knew when he had a bad day at school just by the way he walked through the door. I knew when he was excited about something before he even said a word. Back then, we were inseparable. It was just the two of us against the world. But somewhere along the way, things started to change. It didn't happen overnight. There wasn't a dramatic moment where everything suddenly felt different. It was gradual, almost invisible at first. Zion started spending more time in his room. The door stayed closed longer. Headphones became a permanent part of his life. Conversations that used to last an hour slowly turned into 5-minute exchanges. How was school? Good. What did you do today? Nothing much. I told myself it was normal. Teenagers need space. Every parent says that. Every parenting book says that. But even when your brain understands something, your heart doesn't always catch up right away. Because deep down, I could feel it. The distance, the quiet space slowly growing between us. Then came that Tuesday night. And that's when everything shifted. The house was unusually quiet. Normally, I could hear something coming from Zion's room. Music playing, a video in the background, or the clicking of a gaming controller. But that night, there was nothing, just silence. At first, I tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping into my chest. Maybe he was studying. Maybe he fell asleep early. but the quietness felt different, heavier somehow. So I walked down the hallway. Each step felt louder than usual. I told myself I wasn't trying to invade his privacy. I just wanted to check if he was okay. I stopped in front of his door. For a moment, I hesitated. I should have knocked. I know that now. But in that moment, instinct took over. I slowly pushed the door open. Just a few inches. And in that brief second, I realized something that every parent eventually realizes. My son wasn't a little boy anymore. I immediately stepped back, closed the door quietly, and stood there in the hallway. My heart racing. Not because of what I saw, but because of what it meant. For 19 years, I had been the center of his world. The person he ran to when he was confused. The person he trusted with every secret. But now, he was building a life that didn't revolve around me anymore. And suddenly I realized something that scared me more than anything else. I wasn't ready for that. That night, sleep never came. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment again and again. Not the scene itself, but the realization behind it. My son was growing up, and somehow, somewhere along the way, I hadn't prepared my heart for that moment. The next morning felt strange, not angry, not dramatic. Just different. Zion sat at the breakfast table scrolling on his phone. I stood by the coffee machine pretending to be very focused on pouring coffee. Neither of us looked directly at the other. There was an invisible tension in the air. Not because something bad happened, but because something had changed. And we both knew it. But neither of us knew how to talk about it yet. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper. Something every parent eventually faces. Boundaries. The moment when love stops looking like protection and starts looking like letting go. And the truth is, I didn't know if I was ready for that. But what happened next would force me to face something far bigger than a closed bedroom door. Because a week later, something happened that made me realize this story wasn't just about my son growing up. It was about trust, about influence, about people crossing lines they never should. And when I saw the name that appeared on Zion's phone that afternoon, my heart dropped in a way I can't even explain. Because if I was right about what I had just seen, then this situation wasn't simple anymore, not even close. And what my son was about to tell me next was something I never expected to hear in my life. That next morning passed quietly. Zion finished his breakfast quickly and left for class. I watched him walk out the front door the same way I had watched him leave 1,000 times before. Backpack over one shoulder, headphones already in. But something felt different. For years, when he left the house, he would turn around before stepping outside. Bye, Mom. Sometimes even a quick hug. But that morning, he simply opened the door, stepped outside, and enclosed it behind him. No words. It wasn't intentional. I knew that. But still, I felt it. That strange, quiet distance again. I stood in the kitchen for a moment staring at the empty chair where he had been sitting. And suddenly a realization hit me. Parenthood doesn't come with a manual for this stage. When your child is small, everything feels simple. Feed them, protect them, teach them right from wrong. But when they start becoming adults, the rules change. You can't control everything anymore. And maybe you never really could. That thought stayed with me the entire day. But I had no idea that within a week something would happen that would challenge everything I thought I understood about trust, about boundaries, and about the complicated world my son was stepping into. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. The kind of afternoon where the house feels peaceful. Sunlight was coming through the living room windows, casting soft light across the floor. I was cleaning the house. Just small things. Folding laundry. Straightening the cushions on the couch. The kind of routine chores that make the day pass slowly. Zion had been in the living room earlier, sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone. Then he stood up suddenly. I'm taking the trash out, he said casually. Okay, I replied. He grabbed the garbage bag and stepped outside. And that's when it happened. His phone was still lying on the coffee table. I didn't think much about it at first. It wasn't unusual. But a few seconds later, the phone buzzed. The screen lit up. I glanced at it instinctively. Not to read anything. Just the natural reaction when a phone lights up nearby. The screen went dark again. Then it buzzed once more. And again. 3 notifications in less than a minute. Something about that caught my attention. The screen lit up once more. And this time I saw a message preview. I wasn't trying to read it. I truly wasn't. But the name at the top of the message froze me in place. My stomach tightened instantly. Because it wasn't a name I expected to see on my son's phone. Not at all. In fact, it was the last name I ever thought would appear there. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the phone from across the room. Maybe I misread it. Maybe it was someone with the same name. My mind immediately started searching for explanations, but something deep inside me already knew. The uneasy feeling in my chest started growing. The phone buzzed again. Another message. Another notification. And suddenly the room didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt tense. Like something invisible had just entered the space. I looked toward the front door. Zion was still outside, probably walking to the trash bins at the end of the driveway. I told myself to ignore it. His phone wasn't mine to check. We had just talked about boundaries, privacy, trust. But the name I had seen kept echoing in my mind, over and over again. And the more I thought about it, the more something didn't feel right. A few seconds later, the front door opened. Zion stepped back inside. He closed the door and walked toward the living room. That's when he noticed me standing there. Still, quiet, looking uneasy. You okay? He asked. His voice was casual, but his eyes were observant. Zion had always been good at reading people. Especially me. Yeah, I said quickly. Too quickly. Even to my own ears, it sounded forced. He studied my face for a moment. Then his gaze slowly shifted toward the coffee table. Toward his phone. He picked it up. Looked at the screen. Then looked back at me. And in that moment, I realized something. He already knew. He knew I had seen the notifications. Not the messages, but the name. Did you see my phone? He asked quietly. The question caught me off guard. For a split second, I considered pretending I hadn't noticed anything. But something about the way he asked made lying feel impossible. I saw it light up, I admitted. I wasn't trying to read anything. He nodded slowly, not angry, not defensive. Just thoughtful. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The room felt strangely quiet again. Then he exhaled and sat down on the couch. There's something I probably should tell you, he said. The seriousness in his voice immediately made my heart beat faster. I sat down across from him. What is it? I asked. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. For the first time since he came back inside, he looked nervous. I didn't want to hide anything, he said. I just didn't know how you'd react. My mind immediately started racing. 100 possibilities flashed through my thoughts. Was he in trouble? Had something happened at school? Was someone pressuring him? What do you mean? I asked carefully. Zion looked down at his hands, then back up at me. It's about someone I've been talking to. Under normal circumstances, that sentence wouldn't worry a mother. He was 19. Talking to people was normal. But the name I had seen on his phone earlier kept repeating inside my mind, like a warning. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier. Who? I asked slowly. Zion hesitated. Just for a moment. Then he said a name I was not prepared to hear. The moment the words left his mouth, time seemed to freeze, because the person he had just mentioned wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone from his college. It wasn't a new friend. It was someone connected to our lives. Someone older. Someone who absolutely should have known better. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. Not because I was angry, but because my brain was trying to process how this situation even existed. "How did this start?" I asked quietly. Zion rubbed the back of his neck. "It wasn't like that at first," he explained. "We started talking online." "About what?" "Just normal stuff," he said. "Advice, life, random conversations." He paused, then added something that made my stomach twist slightly. But after a while, it became more personal. The weight of those words hung in the air between us. And suddenly I realized something that every parent fears. This wasn't just about my son growing up anymore. This was about influence, about trust, about someone stepping into his life in a way that might not be healthy. I leaned back in my chair, trying to stay calm. "Zion," I said slowly, "do you understand why this worries me?" He nodded immediately. "Yeah," he said. "I do. But it's not what you think." That sentence echoed in my mind, because almost every complicated situation begins with those exact words. And deep down, I knew something important. The hardest part of being a parent isn't protecting your child from the world. Sometimes, it's facing the truth when the world becomes complicated. And as Zion sat there in front of me, trying to explain something he barely understood himself, I realized this conversation was only the beginning. Because if the connection he was describing had already gone as far as I feared, then the next decision I made as a mother could change everything. And the question that kept repeating in my mind was simple. Did that person truly care about my son? Or were they taking advantage of someone who was still learning how the world works? Because if the second possibility was true, then this story was far from over. And what I would discover next would test every instinct I had as a parent. For a long moment after Zion spoke, neither of us said anything. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I watched my son carefully, not as the little boy I used to tuck into bed, but as the young man sitting across from me, trying to explain something he wasn't even sure how to explain himself. That's one of the strangest parts of parenting. One day you're teaching your child how to tie their shoes, and the next day you're having conversations about situations you never imagined they would face. "Zion," I said gently, "I'm not here to judge you." He nodded slightly. "I know. But I need to understand what's going on." He took a deep breath and leaned back against the couch. "I didn't plan for this to happen," he said quietly. "That's usually how it starts," I replied. He gave a small, nervous smile. Not because anything was funny, but because the tension in the room was thick enough to feel. For a moment, he stared at the ceiling like he was searching for the right words. Then he began explaining. "It started a few months ago," he said. "At first, we were just messaging sometimes. Nothing serious." "What kind of messages?" I asked. "Just normal conversations, advice, talking about life." He paused for a moment before continuing. "You know how sometimes it's easier to talk to someone who isn't directly part of your everyday life?" I nodded slowly. I understood that feeling more than he realized. "But then it started happening more often," he said. "Every day. And eventually, we started sharing more personal things." Something about the way he said that sentence made my chest tighten slightly, because I knew what that meant. Conversations that go beyond casual friendship, conversations that start building emotional connections. "How personal?" I asked carefully. Zion hesitated again, not because he didn't want to answer, but because he knew the answer mattered. "We talked about family," he said, "about stress, about figuring out life." He looked down at his hands again, and sometimes about things I didn't feel comfortable talking about with anyone else. That sentence hit me harder than I expected, not because I felt offended, but because it reminded me of something painful. There are parts of growing up that parents can't fully understand, no matter how much they try. Did you ever meet in person? I asked. Zion shook his head immediately. No. Never? No, he repeated. At least not yet. The words not yet lingered in the air. I noticed them instantly. So you've thought about it, I said quietly. He didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. For a moment, I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. I wasn't angry, but I could feel something else growing inside me. Concern, deep concern. Because the person he was talking about wasn't just some random stranger from the internet. This was someone connected to our lives. Someone older. Someone who understood exactly how young and inexperienced my son still was. And that made the situation much more complicated. Zion, I said slowly, I want you to be honest with me. I am, he replied quickly. I mean, completely honest. He looked at me with a mixture of nervousness and sincerity. Okay. Do you think this person sees you as a friend? Or something more? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the floor for several seconds, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. I'm not sure anymore. Those 4 words said more than a long explanation ever could. Because uncertainty is where complicated relationships begin. I leaned forward slightly. Did they ever say anything that made you uncomfortable? Zion shook his head. No. But sometimes the conversations feel different now. How? They're more personal. In what way? He paused again. More emotional, he finally said. And sometimes more intense. I nodded slowly. Inside my mind, pieces of the puzzle were starting to connect. Not clearly yet, but enough to form a picture. And the picture worried me. Why didn't you tell me earlier? I asked. He shrugged slightly. I didn't think it was a big deal at first. And later? I didn't know how to explain it. He looked at me carefully. And honestly, I thought you'd be upset. I gave a small sigh. That depends on the situation. Well, that's the situation, he said. His honesty caught me off guard for a moment, but I appreciated it. Many teenagers would hide something like this completely. At least Zion was trying to be open. Still. One question kept echoing inside my head. Zion, I said. Do you trust this person? He thought about it for a moment. I think so. You think so? Or you know so? That question made him pause again. And this time the silence lasted longer. Finally, he said something that made my stomach tighten. I trusted them more at the beginning. What changed? I asked. I'm not sure, he replied. Something just started feeling different. Different. That word stayed with me, because intuition is powerful. And if my son's instincts were starting to question something, then I needed to pay attention. Different how? I asked. He ran a hand through his hair. Sometimes the conversations go in directions I didn't expect. Like what? Like talking about meeting up. My chest tightened slightly. Who suggested that? I asked. He hesitated, then quietly said, They did. The moment he said those words, a cold feeling ran through me. Not anger, not yet. Just a strong protective instinct rising inside my chest. Because suddenly the situation felt very real and very serious. I kept my voice calm. Did you agree to meet? No, he said quickly. At least, not yet. There it was again. Not yet. The possibility still hanging in the air. And suddenly I understood something very important. This situation wasn't fully developed yet. It was still unfolding, which meant something critical. There was still time to handle it carefully. Still time to understand what was really happening. Still time to protect my son if he needed protection. But I also knew something else. If I reacted with anger, if I tried to control everything, Zion would shut down immediately, and the truth would disappear behind silence. So instead, I asked the question that mattered most. Zion, I said softly, why do you keep talking to them? He looked at me, and for a moment I saw the same expression he used to have as a child when he was trying to understand something complicated. Because sometimes they make me feel like someone understands what I'm going through. That answer broke my heart in a way I didn't expect. Not because I blamed him, but because it reminded me that even the most loving parents can't always fill every emotional space in their child's life. Sometimes young people look for understanding in places that feel easier, even if those places are complicated. And suddenly I realized something. This wasn't just a story about a risky connection. This was a story about a young man trying to figure out who he was, and someone stepping into that vulnerable moment. The question was, were they helping him grow, or quietly leading him somewhere dangerous? Because if it was the second possibility, then the situation was more serious than Zion realized. And the next thing I discovered later that night would confirm a fear I didn't want to believe. That evening, after our conversation ended, Zion went back to his room. The house became quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Heavier, thoughtful. I sat alone in the living room for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. The conversation we had kept replaying in my mind over and over again. Every sentence, every pause, every moment of hesitation in his voice. As a parent, you develop a strange instinct. You start to hear what your child doesn't say, just as clearly as what they do say. And something about this situation didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the fact that Zion had been talking to someone older, it was the way the connection had formed. Quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, like a slow shift that neither of us fully noticed until it was already happening. I tried to remind myself of something important. Zion wasn't a child anymore. He was 19, legally an adult, someone capable of making his own decisions. But no matter how old your child becomes, part of you will always see the small person they used to be, the one who needed you to explain the world to them. And that part of me was still there, still protective, still worried. Later that night, I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. Zion walked into the living room. He looked tired, but also thoughtful. "Mom?" he said quietly. I looked up. "Yeah? Can we talk again?" I nodded immediately. "Of course." He sat down across from me the same way he had earlier, but this time his posture was different. More certain, more serious. "I've been thinking about what we talked about," he said, and I realized something. I waited. Something about the situation started bothering me too. That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward slightly. At first, the conversations felt normal, but recently, they started pushing things further. "Further how?" I asked. Like asking when we were finally going to meet in person. The words made my stomach tighten again. "And that made you uncomfortable?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah." "Why didn't you say anything to them?" I tried to change the subject a few times, he explained, but they kept bringing it back. There it was, the pressure. Subtle, but real. "And tonight," Zion continued, "after our conversation, I looked back at some of the messages." "What did you notice?" I asked. He took a deep breath. I realized something. "What?" That the conversation slowly shifted over time. At first it was advice, then personal stories, and eventually it started becoming emotional in a way that felt strange. I could see the realization forming in his mind as he spoke. Sometimes understanding arrives slowly, but when it finally clicks, everything suddenly becomes clear. "I think they were trying to create a kind of emotional dependence," he said. Hearing my 19-year-old son say those words surprised me, but it also made me proud, because it meant he was thinking critically, analyzing the situation, learning from it. That's an important realization, I said. He nodded slowly. I didn't notice it at first. But after we talked, I started seeing the pattern. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I didn't expect. I blocked them tonight. I blinked. You did? Yeah. What made you decide that? He shrugged slightly. I asked myself a question. What question? If someone really respects you, would they keep pushing you to do something you're not comfortable with? That answer hit me harder than he probably realized, because that's exactly the kind of lesson most people only learn after painful experiences. But Zion had figured it out before things went too far. I'm proud of you, I said quietly. He looked surprised. You are? Of course. You recognized a problem and handled it. That's not easy. He leaned back slightly, letting out a long breath. I think I just needed to talk about it. Sometimes saying things out loud makes you see them differently. I nodded. That's very true. The room became quiet again, but this silence felt different. Lighter, more peaceful. After a moment, Zion spoke again. You know something? What? I think I understand something now that I didn't understand before. What's that? He looked at me thoughtfully. Growing up doesn't mean figuring everything out alone. Those words stayed with me, because they captured something many people misunderstand. Independence doesn't mean isolation. Maturity doesn't mean rejecting guidance. Sometimes growing up simply means learning how to ask for help when something feels wrong. I'm always here for you, I said. I know, he replied. Then he smiled slightly. And I think I understand now why you were worried. I smiled back. That's part of the job description. He stood up and stretched. I'm going to bed. Okay. He walked toward the hallway, then stopped halfway. And for the first time in a while, he turned back. Good night. Mom. Good night, Zion. I watched him disappear down the hallway, and something inside me felt calmer than it had all day. That night, as I sat alone in the living room again, I realized something important. Parenthood isn't about controlling every step your child takes. It's about giving them the tools to recognize when something isn't right. You can't follow them into every situation. You can't protect them from every influence. But you can teach them how to think, how to question things, how to trust their instincts. And sometimes, that's enough. Because the real goal of parenting isn't raising children who never face complicated situations. It's raising people who know how to navigate those situations wisely. That Tuesday night when I opened Zion's door, I thought I had just witnessed the moment my little boy disappeared forever. But now I understood something different. He hadn't disappeared. He was simply becoming someone new. Someone learning how to stand on his own. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real moment every parent eventually hopes for. Not the day their child stops needing them, but the day they realize their child has learned enough to make the right choices on their own. Some stories aren't loud. They don't explode into chaos. They unfold quietly and change you slowly. And this was one of them.